Welcome to EcoTÜRK, Jim.
It's nice to be here. Thanks for having me on.
Thank you very much for accepting our request. I'd like to start asking with the US government shutdown. Now the whole world is like talking about that, and clearly there's also there are people who are also furloughed as well, and there can be some implications on economy too. What is your view?
Well, I think the only obvious clear thing is that it will play havoc with various economic data over the period of the shutdown, depending quite how long it goes on for. So at the core of what most people spend so much of their time doing with US data is we might not really know what the underlying trends are until we've gone beyond the period after this that, amongst other things, might add to the complications for the Federal Reserve Board trying to judge what is the pace of economic growth. And then beyond that, there's obviously a pretty big political angle to it, which seems to be virtually the case with everything in the United States these days, and what quite falls out from that.
And the other thing is now that we are quite like reporting about is the UK debt and the fiscal policy. And recently, according to IMF data, is like UK's gross domestic debt is now over almost 100%. According to official one, is around 96, and there seems to be a budget deficit as well. And now we're expecting a new budget coming from Rachel Reeves, and the whole country is like talking about that. Do you think this debt levels are sustainable? And also, we've seen austerity, which lasted longer than 14 years. How more that can be carried by any other government?
Yeah, on the one hand, I find it quite remarkable, which probably relates to our own British domestic media intensity, the scale of international focus on the UK debt issue. Because actually, if you look at it in a G7 context, there are at least 3 G7 countries that have a much worse debt situation than the UK: Italy, Japan, and France, and probably the United States. So really, on true international Western standards, there's nothing that stand out about the UK. That said, the second contradictory point is, of course, now for many years and made worse by what the response was to COVID, all of us British people are effectively encouraging our politicians to live in denial about some underlying issues. We are spending far too much, in my judgment, on pensions for people as they age, and they get very strong protections, and we're spending far too much on welfare payments. And somebody in government one of these years is going to have to do something about that. And we have some highly inefficient forms of taxation, particularly in the property and land valuation world. And somebody's going to have to do something about this. Otherwise, at some point in coming years or maybe decade, we will have a debt crisis. But I could say the same about virtually every other G7 country, with a probable exception of Germany.
That is correct, actually. Italy, it's about around 135, France 115, and Japan and US is already quite high anyway. And you're correct with that. I also would like to ask about France as well, because there had been quite a lot of big protests coming against the package, the financial package that's being proposed by the government, and there had been a political unrest as well. So how do you view the things that are taking place in France as well?
So I think that is more troubling than the UK situation for 3 reasons. First of all, the absolute level of French debt is higher than the UK's, as you pointed out. Secondly, the French population's appetite to have spending cuts seems even weaker than the British population's. And I don't know what it is about this generation we're living through, but we all seem to think there is a sort of magic money tree that our central banks and governments can just call on, and there's never any consequence. And I think the markets are telling you that France is getting close to the end of the road of this false belief. I mean, it's quite remarkable to see French bond yields higher than those of Greece and Italy, but it tells you everything you want to know. I mean, who would have dreamt of that a decade ago? And that is the reality. And then the third thing is that to some degree, certainly when it relates to domestic matters, the era in which the president of today, President Macron, is presiding over, is effectively dead because he has to keep on bringing in different prime ministers, all who try pretty hard to put in some kind of fiscal consolidation. And as we keep seeing, it never gets any support from the different parties. So France is in a tricky situation. And of course, from a European perspective, what one would be really concerned about is if we get one of the two extreme left or extreme right becoming the next French president, then we're possibly dealing with a Europe that we haven't seen for at least 4 decades with the early days of President Mitterrand, which might shake the foundations of the stability across the Eurozone, and in particular at the core of it, between France and Germany, which could result in all sorts of issues.
Well, the other question is like if you look at emerging economies that we see now, the European Union has been actually signing free trade deals with Mexico, Indonesia. Do we kind of like see some kind of like shift of prioritizing the emerging economies, especially when it comes to EU, especially the recent relations and upheavals and the troubles that they've kind of experienced with Donald Trump and US?
I spent some time at a conference here in London this week about global monetary affairs, and this topic was front and center. And it's psychologically a huge dilemma that throughout Europe, whether it's the UK or the members of the EU and Eurozone, we are so used to, in our generation, treating the US as not only the most important ally, but the sort of benchmark to who we expect to set the standards. And Trump is breaking those standards for right or wrong across the board, including on trade. And it's quite interesting when I observe policymakers, they're sort of in a partial state of denial in that this is the new normal, let's call it. And I try to point out to them that whilst the US is the world's biggest economy at 25% of GDP, that means the rest of the world is 75% of GDP. And what you might call a sort of complex, sophisticated coalition of the willing that wants to stand for freer trade between that 75% of the world should, in my judgment, vigorously pursue more trade deals between each other. And I think you're seeing a sign of that with what the EU is doing with these emerging countries that you've said. And I strongly encourage them all to be more ambitious because we could reach a point where we wouldn't be so bothered about what the US is doing, other than to sort of find it a bit bizarre that the US is missing out. And I think, I think what the US is doing is detrimental to the economic benefits of the United States. But if that's the path they want to go down, it should not mean that that's what the rest of the world adopts as the standards.
And I'd like to ask you about this, the fear of Russia as well. Of course, like we know the conflict and the war that is going in Ukraine, but at the same time, like now we see kind of like drone issue, and at the same time, now the kind of the case of Ukraine is almost like the responsibility of it has been shifted from US on the shoulders of EU. It seems like that financially as well. And as a result of this, like we also see a huge amounts of public spending in defense. So
Yeah.
looking at the past decades, like how realistic is this fear of Russia? Should we really be in fear, and should we just, how? I'd like you to and analyze
Yeah.
that.
I mean, my honest answer is I don't know. But on the one hand, linked to what I said about trade, the other really big area where the Americans are making it pretty clear that this is not going to be the way of the past is defense. And so my first point is it's probably really good that Europe is thinking a lot more seriously about how it can defend itself. I would argue that the UK and France within the EU have always done that and can cope with this pressure probably a bit better. But it's a big awakening for Germany and probably for many Mediterranean countries, Italy and Spain notably, who so far seem to be not really that enthusiastic. But it is important that sovereign nations and those within the EU, or for that matter, those that aren't, do more about what they think is important for their defense and to make a realistic assessment as to whether Russia is a persistent threat or one that's just a threat at the moment linked to Ukraine. The second point in that, and I ended my first point deliberately because the second point is making a different issue. It is not clear to me that this sort of fashion, partly to keep Trump happy, to make these huge promises about what share of GDP you're going to spend on defense, is actually really ultimately that wise or viable. Because, you know, as we've discussed a few minutes ago, many countries have got serious levels of debt, and they have major expectations by their own populations on spending for many different priorities, including health and pensions, and many other things. And so the idea that many European countries are going to double or triple their share of GDP devoted to defense seems a very fashionable thing to say today, but I'm not really convinced that that will be the persistent and actual reality in terms of where things end up in a few years, because I don't think our voters will really ultimately want that. And speaking as an economist, I don't believe that what economists would call the multipliers from defense spending are as helpful to boosting productivity and long-term growth as a number of other areas of investment.
Well, the other question is I'd like to ask is now that we see especially in UK and France and elsewhere in Europe as well, that kind of like the far right tendencies are increasing. We are seeing the things that we haven't seen before, according to polls. Now the Nigel Farage has been leading party. We've seen over 100,000 people marching in London, and it seems to be a bit boiling. And then we see mass protests taking France. How do you view where are we really heading?
You know, I have a sort of slightly strange judgment about it all. Insofar as the following, in some ways it's quite rational, and I would add in that context, it's not just far right; it's also far left. Here, I just listened on national BBC radio this morning to an interview with the head of the Green Party, who now has a leader who is much more radical and speaks in a way one would associate more with a very left of centre member of the Labour Party. And of course, Jeremy Corbyn appears to be on the verge of setting up a new left-leaning party. So it's not just the far right. They're the ones that are getting the most notoriety and most success. But here's my central point where I think I differ from many other people. To some degree, it's quite rational that, you know, when you think about the last 30 years or more, the way global economic growth has progressed and developed, which has been in aggregate actually pretty good. In many economies, especially in older ones that had industrialization early on, there are significant parts of their communities that have not benefited from any of that. And that shows you that aspects of the liberal international economic model haven't worked. And so at some point, it's not surprising that people have had enough of these mainstream political parties and are easily gullible and attracted to populist parties that promise all sorts of wild things, and people think, well, we'll give them a chance.
Mhm.
And the ultimate solution, in my opinion, is for the mainstream liberal parties, and this is very relevant here in the UK today, and in France and in Germany, they have to be more sincere about undertaking structural change to deliver better productivity and better growth and more inclusive growth that more people benefit from. And you know, it's very easy for me to say these things, but I mean it. And I think ultimately there will be at some very hard to predict point, the re-emergence of more centralist parties that actually show they can undertake serious change that helps more people and boosts growth. And I would love that to be the government we have in the UK at the moment, but they're going to have to demonstrate it sooner or later, otherwise their problems are going to get bigger.
Right. Well, my last question is going to be about Turkey and how do you view Turkey? As usual, I'd like to ask because you mentioned about the security needs in growing security needs and defense spendings in Europe, and at the same time, EU and Turkey has kind of a bumpy relation since 1960s, even longer than that. And do you think the current circumstances are bringing them together? And because there are also the talks of Turkey taking place in BRICS as well. Where do you see Turkey?
You know, I was thinking in advance of the discussion about this philosophically, because I knew you'd ask. You know, in many ways, it's really remarkable. As you say, Turkey has had this rocky relationship with the EU for so long, and yet everything still seems to sort of carry on. So you know, in a strange way, and maybe this goes to the core geographic reality and irony, beautiful irony of Turkey, that Turkey is just so wonderfully positioned with the EU to its west and Russia to the north, all the chaos, but also opportunity with the Middle East to its south. And of course, a lot of excitements and potential huge trade growth to the east with the more you go east in Asia. And so I think Turkey is amazingly uniquely benefited and will continue to do so from all of those opportunities and you know, despite the contradictions that go with it. And that seems to be how Turkey still progresses. If you look at the latest forecasts of conventional forecasting bodies like the IMF, it's very interesting to see them revising higher their forecast for Turkish GDP growth this year, which is not what's happening in many other places. And of course, everybody's been quite rightly concerned about Turkish inflation, which doesn't seem to be quite as big a threat as it was. And then if you put together how the lira is when the global markets are excited that the lira is stable and benefits from a lot of capital inflow, and when it's so-called risk off, the opposite happens, and all of this just seems to just carry on. And the sort of day of reckoning that occasional analysis might suggest is coming for Turkey, where it has to raise its savings rate and be less dependent on foreign capital, just seems to never happen. And maybe that's actually a reality of how things are. But when it comes to how does Turkey deal with it from a political alliance perspective, I don't look at it very closely, but superficially it seems as though the Turkish leadership just about manages it pretty well. And you know, why do you have to be in one camp when you can be in everybody's camp, which seems to be effectively how the Turkish leadership seems to manage these things.
Thank you very much, Jim. This was amazing. Like, it was a pleasure to interview with you again.
Okay, it's very nice to chat to you. It's been quite a while.
Thank you. Thanks a lot.